If you're not already subscribed to this podcast, do subscribe on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you're listening to it. And if you are enjoying my work and want to support it, you can head over to my Substack. The link is in the description, or on Patreon, and become a paying member. And thank you to all those who are already supporting my work. Without further ado, let's get into it.
You know, wherever one goes in the world, human beings are more or less the same. Their manners, behaviors, and outward pattern of action may differ, but psychologically, inwardly, their problems are the same. Man throughout the world is confused. That is the first thing one observes. Uncertain, insecure, he is groping, searching, asking, looking for a way out of this chaos. So he goes to teachers, to yogis, to gurus, to philosophers. He is looking everywhere for an answer, and probably that is why most of you are here. Because we want to find a way out of this trap in which we are caught, without realizing that we as human beings have made this trap. It is our own making and nobody else's. The society in which we live is the result of our psychological state. The society is ourselves. The world is ourselves. The world is not different from us. What we are, we have made the world because we are confused. We are ambitious. We are greedy, seeking power, position, prestige. We are aggressive, brutal, competitive, and we build a society which is equally competitive, brutal, and violent. It seems to me that our responsibility is to understand ourselves first, because we are the world. This is not an egotistic, limited point of view, as you will see when you begin to go into these problems. What is the problem when we observe the actual world around us and in us? Is it an economic problem, a racial problem, black against white, the communist against the capitalist, one religion opposed to another religion? Is that the problem? Or is the problem much deeper, much more profound, a psychological problem? Surely it is not merely an outward, but much more an inward problem. As we said, man by nature is aggressive, brutal, competitive, dominating. You can see this in yourself if you observe yourself. So if you will, use the speaker to observe yourself. Use the speaker as a mirror in which you see yourself without any distortion, and thereby learn what you actually are. That was an excerpt from You Are the World by Jiddhu Krishnamurti. This book, You Are the World, is a compilation of 12 talks that he gave across universities in the United States. So this book is a transcript of those talks that he gave. Krishnamurti is an Indian philosopher and an influential spiritual figure. He's not well known inside of academia, so if you studied philosophy, you wouldn't have come across him. But if you are outside of academia, you have most certainly come across Krishnamurti. A brief background on his life will give context as to why he teaches what he teaches. And so with Krishnamurti, when he was young, he was considered mentally unstable and didn't do very well in school. He also lost his mother and sister at quite a young age, which impacted him. And in 1909, Charles Leadbeater, who was part of the Theosophical Society in India, saw Krishnamurti and was astonished by the aura emanating from Krishnamurti. And so he went back to the society and said, I have found the person who is going to become the world teacher. And so the Theosophical Society adopted Krishnamurti and raised him to be a world teacher. But as Krishnamurti grew older and he started to see and experience things that were not necessarily in line with what the Theosophical Society had taught him, this ended up causing a rift in the relationship between Krishnamurti and the Theosophical Society. And eventually he distanced himself from the society, giving away land that was given to him, renouncing himself as the world leader, and going on a tour to teach people that there is no one who can teach you other than yourself. This idea that to learn, to truly understand the world, to truly understand reality as such, you don't need an authority figure. And you can see why this is the position that Krishnamurti ends up taking. So now going into the book itself, now going into You Are the World. So that excerpt in the beginning captures part of what Krishnamurti's message is. And it is that you are the world that we live in. Many people want to escape this world by going into monasteries, by going away into mountains, into caves. But Krishnamurti says, the world that we live in exists because it is a reflection of who we are. It is a mirror reflection of who we are. And so if we want to change the world, you have to become the change you want to see. And he says you cannot change the world and you cannot change yourself if you do not know yourself. And that is a theme that goes across all of his talks. And so he says, when one observes oneself as one actually is, then either one is moved to despair because one considers himself as hopeless, ugly, miserable, or one looks at oneself without judgment. And to look at oneself without any judgment is the greatest importance, because that is the only way you can understand yourself and know about yourself. And in observing oneself objectively, one realizes how terribly one is conditioned by the economic pressures, by the culture in which one has lived, by the climate, by the food one eats, by the propaganda of the so-called religious organizations, or by the communists. This conditioning is not superficial, but it goes down very deeply, and so one asks whether one can ever be free of it. Because if one is not free, then one is a slave. Then one lives in incessant conflict and battle, which has become the accepted way of life. You notice that he said, when you look at yourself and you observe yourself, the two ways you can see and observe yourself is one, by judging and seeing yourself as ugly, miserable, hopeless, full of despair. Or the other side is observing yourself without any judgment. And he says that is the way to do it, because when you place no judgment, then you can see yourself fully for who you are and not what you pretend to be in the eyes of others and also in your own eyes. And only through that can you become free, because you can become detached in this way. And the reason he says to observe yourself in this non-judgmental way is that you don't end up creating a conflict between the observer and the thing that is being observed. And one of the points that Krishnamurti makes over and over again is the conflict, the battle that we are engaged in this world is the result of us thinking that we are different than the other people around us. And we have placed ourselves as the observer and others as the observed. And when you do this, you create this conflict. And there is this gap that is created, this space, he says, that is created. Only when you realize that you are not different than your neighbor, and that difference, the space between you and your neighbor, is a superficial one. That is when you begin your journey of knowing yourself. And I'm quoting Krishnamurti, if you have understood yourself deeply, learned about yourself through choiceless awareness, and have laid the foundation of righteousness, which is order, you are free, and you do not accept any so-called spiritual authority whatsoever, though one must accept certain laws of society. So two things here. This idea of choiceless awareness we'll get to when we're talking about how he understands meditation and how he understands living in the present moment. But you can see straight away that he says, if you have understood yourself deeply, learned about yourself through choiceless awareness, you have laid the foundation of righteousness, which is order, and you are free. And you are free because you are no longer dependent on anyone else. You're not comparing yourself to anyone else. And that is what allows you to not be dependent on spiritual authorities and spiritual figures and teachers and gurus, which we'll get to in just a bit. And he goes on to say, stop comparing yourself to everyone, to your heroes. Only then will you see that what actually is far more important than what should be. To be free of the process of comparison requires discipline. And the reason he says stop comparing yourself to everyone is that one, it causes fear, and it also robs you of your ability to be present in this moment and to experience the moment fully for what the moment has to give. And the second thing that he says don't compare yourself to heroes, because what ends up happening is there's always a gap between you and your heroes, between should be, how you should act, and what reality is as such. And this space between should be and is what causes conflict, and conflict is what ends up leading to the pain that is in the world, according to Krishnamurti. And when he says this whole process of comparison, to be free of this comparison requires freedom, he understands freedom in the classical sense of discipline as learning, discipline as somebody being a disciple of knowledge, not as rigidity, not in a militaristic manner. And that is important to remember when we use the term discipline in this context. For Krishnamurti, discipline is learning. Learning means to be constantly learning without accumulating knowledge. Because he says, nobody can know truth because truth is living. And if you say you know truth, it means it's become static. And if truth is living, that means truth is not static. So whatever it is that you say you know, which you claim is truth, is not the same thing as the reality. So that's important to keep in mind. So returning to this idea that you are the world, he says, in oneself lies the whole world. And if you know how to look and learn, then the door is there and the key is in your hand. Nobody on earth can give you either that key or the door to open except yourself. Here again, he's emphasizing the idea that there is nobody else that will free you from yourself, that will help you know yourself. The only person who has the key is yourself, and the only person who can open that door is yourself. But if you abandon this task of knowing yourself, if you do not pick up the key, if you do not open the door, then you will live in a world of conflict, then you will live in a world of fear and pain. And that's why in the excerpt that we read, Krishnamurti says, uncertain, insecure, he, meaning man, is groping, searching, asking, looking for a way out of this chaos. So he goes to teachers, to yogis, to gurus, to philosophers. He's looking everywhere for an answer, and probably that is why most of you are here, because we want to find a way out of this trap in which we are caught, without realizing that we, as human beings, have made this trap. It is our own making and nobody else's. The funny thing is that Krishnamurti is very well aware that at the same time he says, do not listen to any gurus, do not listen to any teachers, to any philosophers. He is out in the world giving these talks where hundreds or thousands of people come and listen to him, take his advice. And to me, this captures the reality of life, this paradox that most of life exists within. And the interesting thing to know about Krishnamurti is that he was adamant that none of his followers, none of his close friends would ever claim themselves to be a Krishnamurti scholar, to be a Krishnamurti expert, to be the disciple who had the best knowledge for interpreting Krishnamurti's work. He made sure that there was no such thing as that. He wanted his message to be as pure as he had gave it the first time. So you'll notice that there aren't any Krishnamurti experts, and I think that has a strong play into why Krishnamurti within academic circles is quite unknown. And I'd only come across Krishnamurti maybe 4 or 5 years ago, around 2018, 2019. And before that, I didn't even know who Krishnamurti was. And then once I learned about him, I realized how well known he is outside of academic circles and how much wisdom there is in his books and his messages. Now, returning to the point about knowing yourself, Krishnamurti says, to learn about myself and to know about myself, the two things are entirely different. Learning is a constant, non-accumulative process, and myself is something changing all the time. New thoughts, new feelings, new variations, new imitations, new hints. And he goes on to say, to learn is not something related to the past or the future. I cannot say I have learned and I'm going to learn. So the mind must be in a constant state of learning, therefore always in the active present, always fresh, not stale with the accumulated knowledge of yesterday. And this plays an important role in how he understands meditation and how he understands living in the present, how he understands the relationship that you have with one another, the relationship that you have with your husband, with your wife, with your girlfriend, with your boyfriend, with your friends, with your siblings, with your parents. According to Krishnamurti, this idea of learning, where people think learning is the accumulation of knowledge and using that accumulated knowledge to then act in the world, he says, yes, that is important for when you're going to work, when you're doing things. But when you bring that into a relationship, what ends up happening is that you end up judging the other person based on the past, based on what they did in the past, what they've done, what they've said, how they've lived, and so that you actually never end up experiencing the person in front of you for who they really are. Rather, you only end up experiencing a past version of themselves. And so ultimately, this ends up causing a conflict, ends up causing strife within the relationship, because you only see what you want to see. You only see that which you have been able to acquire, accumulate the knowledge over time. So there might be things that this person has done, has changed over days, over weeks, over years, that your mind is unable to comprehend and see because your mind is clouded. You have a fog over your eyes filled with the past, and so you cannot see the present at this point. And I think that's a great reminder for us, for you and I, to take a step back and see whether and how often we do this with our own relationships. How much past knowledge are we bringing into the relationship such that it's causing strife, it's causing conflict? But what if there is pain involved in that past? And what if that pain returns when you are in that relationship? And Krishnamurti says, first of all, I do not want to block out anything, neither pleasure nor pain. I want to understand it, look at it, go into it. To block out something is to resist. And where there is resistance, there is fear. The brain, the mind, has been conditioned to resist. So can the mind see the truth that any resistance is a form of fear? Which means I must give attention to what is called resistance. Be completely attentive to resistance, which is to block out, escape, take a drink, take drugs, any form of escape or resistance. Be completely altered to it. This is reminiscent of Eckhart Tolle's The Power of Now, which is an episode that we've done, where Tolle says very similar thing, and Tolle is influenced by Krishnamurti, so that's why there's that similarity. And Krishnamurti's point and Tolle's point is that when you're in the present and pain arises or some distraction arises, do not try to separate yourself from it. Accept it fully, and in accepting it, observe it and look at it and go into it. Do not separate yourself from the pain that you're experiencing. As I mentioned earlier, Krishnamurti loses his mother and his sister quite early on, I think around the age of 10. And then later on in life, he ends up losing his brother, who had always suffered some sort of physical ailment. But part of the reason why Krishnamurti ends up having distanced himself from the Theosophical Society is partially, or is largely due to the fact that the Theosophical Society, the teachers there, had said that his brother was going to play an important role, and that his brother wasn't going to die from his sickness, while Krishnamurti was the world teacher, but his brother ends up dying quite early on while Krishnamurti is actually traveling. And so this causes a serious amount of stress on Krishnamurti. And after his brother's death, it is described that Krishnamurti became immensely quiet, radiant, and free of all sentiment and emotion. These tragedies act as a catalyst for Krishnamurti to go deeper and deeper into himself and to understand himself better. And so he says, one sees that one has to make the journey of understanding by oneself. One sees that there is no authority. Every form of authority has failed. Man set up these authorities as a guide, as a means of bringing freedom, peace, and because they have failed, they have lost their meaning, and hence there is a general revolt against the authorities, spiritual, moral, and ethical. And as I mentioned earlier, why it's important to know yourself according to Krishnamurti is if you don't know yourself, there's going to be conflict. And according to Krishnamurti, most people don't know themselves, and as such, there is a tremendous amount of conflict in the world because of it, because the world is simply a reflection of who we are. And so Krishnamurti says, there are whole separate worlds, the ideological divisions of the Hindu, the Muslim, the Christians, the communist, which have brought about such incalculable harm, such hatred and antagonism. All ideologies are idiotic, whether religious or political, for it is conceptual thinking, the conceptual word which has so unfortunately divided man. And he goes on to say later on, we have created society, and that society has conditioned us. Our minds are tortured and heavily conditioned by morality, which is not moral. The morality of society is immorality, because society admits and encourages violence, greed, competition, ambition, and so on, which are essentially immoral. The reason these, according to Krishnamurti, are immoral is precisely because violence, greed, competition, ambition are zero-sum games. There's a winner and there's a loser. If you take violence, there's a winner. Somebody wins in a fight and somebody loses. In greed, somebody hoards as much as possible of whatever it is that they want. In competition, same thing. There's somebody who wins and somebody who loses. In ambition, you step on other people to get to where you are. Not always the case, but according to Krishnamurti, there is this conflict that occurs with all these things. And so he says, the society we live in is not moral. It's immoral because we praise men and women who are good at these things. And oftentimes we want to emulate them. And that is the problem, according to Krishnamurti. So what can we do to bring about a change, bring about a new world into this reality? And he says, you have to find freedom. And freedom is being free of everything, the past, the future, ideas about yourself, ideas of the world, is to be here without the tugging of the past or the future. And that is what he wants to get at. So he says, freedom is not an idea. A philosophy written about freedom is not freedom. Either one is free or one is not. One is in prison. One is in a prison, however decorative the prison is. A prisoner is free only when he is no longer in prison. Freedom is not a state of mind that is caught in thought. So the last part when he says, freedom is not a state of mind that is caught in thought. This idea of thought is a recurring theme within You Are the World. For Krishnamurti, thought is somebody whose mind is overly active, somebody who's always thinking about tomorrow, somebody who's always thinking about the past, somebody who's filled with fear, somebody who does not know how to exist without judgment. That is somebody caught in thought. And anybody caught in thought creates a world of fear of what might happen tomorrow, of fear of not wanting to repeat a mistake that they made in the past. He says those are people caught in thought. Those are people who are not free, who have not escaped prison. He goes on to describe freedom as saying, so the mind, without being free from fear and the search for the deepening and the widening of pleasure, which brings pain and anxiety and all the burden and travail of pleasure, such a mind is not free. The speaker is emphatic, but don't be persuaded by him, for he has not authority at all in this matter of finding out. There is no authority. There is no guru. There is no teacher. You are the teacher and the disciple yourself. Two things he's warning against here is without being free from fear, you will be consumed with wanting to experience more pleasure, and as a result end up experiencing more pain and anxiety. Though you might attain the pleasure, you will always have pain and anxiety because you want more pleasure once that pleasure is done. And the second thing he's warning again is there is no authority, there is no guru out there who will teach you how to do this. He says you have to be your own teacher. You have to become your own disciple. And the only way to do that is to know yourself. And as we mentioned in the previous episode with Lao Tzu, Lao Tzu says you have to know yourself. To be free, you have to know yourself. And then he goes on to address the concern that, well, to change yourself, it takes time. It takes weeks to learn. It takes months to get disciplined to be able to do the things. But Krishnamurti says, no, it doesn't. It doesn't take time. Time is a construct that you've created for yourself because it is the thought that creates it. The change that you want to be free of yourself, to be free of fear, it can be immediate. It can happen right now. So he goes on to say, there is an immediate change psychologically, inwardly, when the division of the observer from the observed comes to an end. Put it differently, one lives in the past. All knowledge is of the past. One lives here. One's life is there, in what has been, concerned with what I was, and from that, what I shall be. One's life is based essentially on yesterday, and yesterday makes us invulnerable. So yesterday is the observer. In the observer are all the layers of the consciousness as well as the unconscious. Krishnamurti is making the point that so long as the observer-observed distinction exists, no change can happen. And change, if you want change, will take a lifetime. It could take 40, 50 years. But the way that change can be immediate is you remove this distinction between the observed and the observer, between the one who's analyzing and the one that is being analyzed. The moment you remove these two superficial labels, that is when you become free. and because you become free of the past, because you're no longer observing yourself in the past, and you're no longer observing yourself in the future. So let's talk about fear before we talk about meditation, before we talk about living in the present. What is fear? How does it come about? And so Krishnamurti says, and I quote, "What is fear? One is afraid of the past, of the present, or of something that might happen tomorrow. Fear involves time. One is afraid of death that is in the future, or one is afraid of something that has happened, or one is afraid of the pain one has had when one was ill. Fear implies time. One is afraid of something that might take place tomorrow." And if you take a moment and reflect on that quote about fear, as fear being that which you think might happen in the future, or that which has happened in the past and you're afraid to make the same mistake in the future, it's quite accurate in the way he understands it. And it's also true that, as Krishnamurti says, fear implies time. One is afraid of something that might take place tomorrow. And as a result, you end up creating this linear connection between the present and the future. And this linear connection is that fear. It travels back and forth between you and you in the future. And throughout the book, Krishnamurti makes the point adamantly that fear is the source of all the problem in the world. It is the fear that you have of your neighbor who is of a different color, is of a different religion, is of a different political stripe, that causes tension in your relationships, that causes tension in the society. And the fear that somebody doesn't believe the same thing that you believe in. And that lack of belief is going to cause something that's going to happen after you die. He says this type of fear, these are all unfounded fears. But if you can overcome those fears, if everybody can overcome those fears and not have those fears and project those fears onto others and onto yourself, the world will be different. The world will not be full of violence, full of greed, full of competition, full of ambition, full of strife, full of anxiety. And he says, you are faced with the fact that you are fear, not an observer who is afraid of fear. You are the observer and the observed, the analyzer and the thing analyzed. Again, bringing it all back to yourself, to realize that this world that we're living in is simply a projection of all your fears, of all your anxiety out there. But it first of all existed in you, and that's what he wants to get across. And continuing with this observation about fear being connected to the past and to the future and to this idea of memory, he says, what sustains and gives continuity to the fear of the past and also to the fear of the future? Surely it is thought. Thought of what one has done in the past, or of how a particular disease has given pain, and one is afraid of the future repetition of that pain. Fear is sustained by memory, by thinking about it. And it's not that Krishnamurti wants you to stop thinking and become a fool. But in one sense, he does want you to become a fool insofar as he follows the idea that a wise man is one who says he does not know, and being able to exist in this ambiguity, that is wisdom. And that's why Krishnamurti says, thought ultimately is the enemy of yourself. And I quote, thought which puts together time as yesterday, today, and tomorrow breeds fear. Thought creates the interval between now and what might happen in the future. Thought perpetuates fear through psychological time. Thought is the origin of fear. Thought is the source of sorrow. And he continues in the following page saying, when one sees how thought breeds fear, then what takes place? When one is hungry and someone describes how lovely food is, what does one do? What is one's response? One will say, don't describe food to me, give it to me. The action is there, direct, not theoretical. So when one says, I understand, it means that there is a constant movement of learning about thought and fear and pleasure. From this constant movement, one acts. One acts in the very movement of learning. And when there is such learning about fear, there is the ending of fear. That's a good analogy with food. When you're hungry and you tell that to somebody and that other person finds out, if they describe food to you, the last thing you want is some sort of theoretical concept about how the beef is going to taste, texture, the type of salt it's used. If you're hungry, don't describe the food to me. Give me the food. I want to eat it. And similarly, Krishnamurti is pointing at when you understand what fear is and what fear causes, then the last thing you want to do is, be abstract about this idea of fear. Instead, you go act. And the way you act is, he's going to say it's through the meditation. It's through living in the present. And so let's move into this idea of meditation that he has. Krishnamurti says of meditation, and I'm quoting, "When we speak of meditation, we must be clear as to whether it is with the intent to escape from life, the daily grind, the boredom, anxiety, and fear, or as a way of life. Either through meditation we seek to escape altogether from this mad and ugly world, or it is the very understanding, living and acting in life itself. If we want to escape, then there are various schools, the Zen monasteries in Japan, and the many other systems. We can see why they are so tempting, for life, as it is very ugly, brutal, competitive, ruthless. It has no meaning whatsoever as it is. When the Hindus offer their systems of yoga, their mantras, their repetition of words and so on, we may obviously be tempted to accept rather easily and without much thought, for they promise a reward, a sense of satisfaction and escape. So let us be very clear, we are not concerned with any escape, either through a contemplative, visionary life, through drugs, or the repetition of words. The temptation becomes quite obvious when you realize how corrupt, how brutal the world is, and how there's so much fear in this world. The temptation to go and live in a monastery, in the woods, on the mountains, in a cave, away from society, away from people, and just be by yourself with your own thoughts, with your own books, and with brothers or sisters who are in the same vocation, where there might be vows of silence, there might be rules and regulations of speaking little, engaging very little with society. That becomes very alluring once you understand the brokenness of this world. But as Krishnamurti earlier pointed out, the brokenness of this world is a reflection of who you are, is the reflection of your greed, of your violence, of your uncontrolled inhibition. And so if you escape from this world, you are escaping from yourself. Hence, he says, so let us be very clear, we are not concerned with any escape, either through a contemplative, visionary life, through drugs, or the repetition of words. And the reason he says through drugs or the repetition of words is because he's giving these talks around the hippie movement, where people are taking drugs, psychedelics especially, to escape the reality that their country is at war with another country. And so he's saying, look, meditation is not supposed to be an escape. And especially if you're using drugs to escape reality, to ignore your own problems, to not go further into knowing who you are, to learn about yourself. His point is you are doing all of this wrong, incorrectly. You have missed the point of meditation. And this is why he goes on to say, meditation is not a fragmentation of life. It is not a withdrawal into a monastery or in a room, sitting quietly for 10 minutes or an hour, trying to concentrate, to learn to meditate, and yet for the rest being a hideous, ugly human being. If you see meditation as an escape from real life, right, as a fragmentation of your life, where for that 10, 20, 30 minutes you're meditating, you are calm, you are serene, you are filled with love, you are filled with peace. But the moment the meditation finishes, you go and treat the first person you meet immorally, without love, without a sense of humanity, and mistreat them. You have missed the point of meditation, and you have not even understood what it means to meditate. And according to Krishnamurti, you are not even meditating to begin with. You're doing something completely different. And as I was reading this, I wondered what he would say about these meditation companies that's coming up. Companies that are coming up around how to meditate, what to do, whether those companies actually treat the people within the organizations well, or if there's a conflict within the mission of these meditation apps and the way they actually treat people. And if it's the latter, where they treat people poorly, then Krishnamurti will say, you have not understood meditation at all. Again, for Krishnamurti, it's very important that there is no authority who teaches you how to meditate, who teaches you a system for meditating. He thinks that if there is a system, if there's a method that comes with the meditation you're learning, that means you have outsourced your thinking, outsourced your responsibility to know yourself onto somebody else. So he says, when you examine a method, a system, what is implied in it? Somebody says, do these things, practice them day after day for 12, 20, 40 years, and you will ultimately come to a reality. A mind made dull by a method cannot possibly be intelligent and free to observe. Once you've outsourced your practice, your thinking, your meditation onto somebody else by following their system, by following their method, according to Krishnamurti, you cannot possibly be intelligent and free to observe the reality of yourself, to become free of your past, to become free of fear. And you're not free because you are dependent on the system, on this guru who's teaching you, who's guiding you through these things. He doesn't actually, and you are dependent on this guru, on this teacher to teach you how to do these things. Krishnamurti, mind you, has nothing against somebody who guides you, right? Who points you, he says. No problem with that, because he says all teachers, all gurus are supposed to point people towards the truth, towards the reality, towards whatever it is. But the problem, according to Krishnamurti, is these gurus have been caught up in their own fame, in their own vanity, such that they forgot that they were a guide, that they were a signpost. Rather, they wanted to become the destination. And in becoming that destination, they've corrupted this idea of being a real teacher. And Krishnamurti goes on to criticize systems that teach people to repeat words over and over again. That is in all the traditions of whether that's Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity. He says all of these have practices where there's this idea of repeating words over and over again. And I'm quoting, "Now you can repeat a word like Coca-Cola or Pepsi-Cola, whatever you will, and you will have an extraordinary feeling." And he's saying that you will have an extraordinary feeling both sarcastically and also he's being quite sincere. Because he says you'll have this calm, extraordinary feeling because you've dulled your mind and you've silenced your mind. But you've silenced your mind through the repetition of words, through some form of system. And in so doing, you are no longer free because your mind has become dull. Right? And if you remember the previous quote, he's saying, methods cannot possibly make you intelligent and free to observe. And so if your mind is dull, you're not intelligent and you're not free to observe. And so the question is, why do these forms of repetition exist? And Murti says, the idea, meaning of repetition, is that if you practice the method laid down by the guru, you will daily achieve a greater degree of understanding or of silence, getting closer to heaven, closer to the greatest thing on earth or beyond the earth. He understands there is a goal attached to this repetition, to the system, and it's to get you from one place to another. But he doesn't think that you need these systems. He thinks that these systems hinder you from actually getting to the reality, getting to the truth about who you are and what your relationship is to others, to the world. Hence he says, so through close examination, understanding and intelligence, one can disregard the mere repetition of words and one can disregard altogether the guru. He who stands for authority, the one who knows as against the one who doesn't know. The guru, the man who says he knows, does not know. And the remaining question then is, how then do we meditate? And he answers this question on page 130 when he says, in understanding ourselves, obviously lie the beginning of meditations. And so it takes us back to this idea of knowing yourself, in being able to be free of fear, to be free of judgment, to be free of time. And that leads to this idea of living in the moment and being free of thought, right? Because that is how you understand yourself. And it is through knowing yourself that you're able to live in the moment without any fear, without any sense of hindrance. In the book, he has this analogy of the sunset that he brings up over and over again. And he says, can one look at the sunset and be completely involved in the beauty of that sunset without bringing into it the question of pleasure? What he's getting at with the sunset analogy is when you see a sunset, a beautiful sunset, and you're enjoying it on top of a hill. You're seeing the sky lit up in orange, and you're experiencing the beauty and the greatness of that moment. But then a thought comes to you and says, oh, this is so beautiful, I want to experience it again. Or maybe I'll pull out my phone or my camera to try to capture this moment. Or you go, let me try to remember this as much as possible so that I can go back and paint. Or you go, let me return to this spot tomorrow at the same time so I can experience this again. And for Krishnamurti, these thoughts that appear and they make their way into you when you're experiencing the sunset are what divorces you from that moment, from understanding yourself. And it prevents you from fully enjoying the greatness of that moment. Krishnamurti goes on to observe that if you're unable to experience the moment in its fullness, in its greatness, then you've missed the moment. And the only way you can experience the fullness of the moment is to be completely present in that moment without your past self trying to tell you how beautiful it is and comparing that moment to a previous moment, or your future self trying to capture as much of it as possible so that you can go into the future and draw it or come back to it in the future and experience this whole thing again. For Krishnamurti, all of this misses the point of living in the present. What then do we do when a thought appears when you're completely engrossed in the moment? And I quote Krishnamurti, don't do anything. If you do something, you bring conflict into it. But when you see the sunset and thought comes in, be aware of it. Be aware of the sunset and the thought that comes into it. Don't chase thought away. Be choicelessly aware of this whole thing, the sunset and thought coming into it. And this is where the idea of choiceless awareness comes up. And this means that you are aware of the things that are happening to you, the thoughts that are coming in, but you're not judging it. You're not making any choice around it, whether it's good, whether it's bad, whether you should be having this thought. You simply observe it and let it pass. And in so doing, you become free, because then you are free of the past and of the future. He goes on to say, most people say they live in the moment, or they tell people to live in the moment, but they actually don't understand what that means, since they are often experiencing the present moment with their old self from the past. So long as the one, he says, who is experiencing the present moment is anything other than the present self, without any baggage from the past or from the future, Krishnamurti says, then you are not living in the present. And I quote him, you are the past looking at the present, translating the present. The present being the challenge, the pain, the anxiety, a dozen things which are the result of the past. So you see here, he's saying, look, you are the past in the present. But the present is experiencing all these anxieties, these pains, the fears, precisely because the past is the one living in the present state. Quite a fascinating take here. It made me think about how much of our lack of being able to experience the present moment is all due to the baggage that we have from the past. And on how thought prevents you from being in the moment, he says, thought can never be free. Thought is the response of a memory, knowledge, and experience. It is always the product of the past, and it cannot possibly bring about freedom, because freedom is something that is in the living, active present in daily life. If we take these three words, living, active, present, and work backwards from it, so present being the present moment, and active, if we take it to be being actively aware of that present moment, of all the things that's around it, and fully engaged in all of these things, and then living being as living in this precise present moment actively without baggage of the past, then I think you can sum up how Krishnamurti understands being free of thought and being able to live in the moment. Which brings up the point about choicelessly being aware, or choiceless awareness. And he has this quote, if that awareness is choosing, then you are blocking it. But if that awareness is without choice, everything is exposed. The most hidden and secret demands, fears, and compulsions. Meaning, if you are not taking any stance on the thoughts that are coming in and out as you're experiencing the moment, you will notice that choiceless awareness will expose the hidden, the secret things of your heart, of your mind. And then can you start to know yourself? And this section sums up all that we've talked about living the present, about thought, about fear, about knowing yourself. On page 95, he says, we draw a circle around ourselves, a circle around me, a circle around you. Having drawn the circle, whether it is the circle of me and you, or the family, or the nation, the formula of religious beliefs and dogmas, the circle of knowledge one weaves around oneself, these circles divide us, and so there is this constant division which invariably brings about conflict. We never go beyond the circle, never look beyond it. We are afraid to leave our own little circle and discover the circle, the barrier around another. And I think that therein begins the whole process, the structure and the nature of fear. One builds a barrier around oneself, enclosing a private world very carefully made up of formulas, concepts, words, and convictions. Then, living within those walls, one is afraid to go outside. This division not only breeds various forms of neurotic behavior, but also a great deal of conflict. And if we abandon one circle, one wall, we build another wall around ourselves. So there is this constant, enduring resistance built on concepts, and one wonders whether it is at all possible not to have any division at all, to end all division, and thus bring an end to all conflict. And the challenge for us this week is, can you meditate without any method, without any structure or system that you've learned from somebody or from some app? Can you meditate in such a way, as Krishnamurti says, to be fully present in the moment, to allow all the thoughts that occur to you to pass in and out and become choicelessly aware? That's the first one. The second one is, when you are experiencing a moment of greatness, a moment of joy this week, make sure you do it without the past self talking to you or the future self talking to you. Make sure you're experiencing it in all the fullness, such that when you finish experiencing it, you've filled up your cup, that you've experienced the moment for all that it has to offer. And with that, I'll wrap. Thank you for listening to this podcast. If you haven't already subscribed, do subscribe and leave me a rating on Apple Podcast or on Spotify. It helps tremendously, helps people find this podcast. Till next week, peace.